If you were a very close devotee of Bhagavan, then it was occasionally permitted that if you had some private business you wanted to discuss, you could follow him up the hill. That was a right and a privilege restricted to very few, but it did occasionally happen. I'm thinking in particular of Papaji, who had been told by Devaraja Mudaliar that he should go back to the Punjab and rescue his family in 1947 because they were marooned on the wrong side of the new international boundary. He wanted to plead his case with Bhagavan, so he followed Bhagavan up the hill in July 1947 and explained his predicament. Bhagavan always insisted that family people should look after their family without exception. Papaji said, "But to me, Bhagavan, they're all a dream. My whole past life before I came to you is a dream. I'm so attached to your form, I'm so in love with your form, there's no possibility that I can tear myself away from it." And Bhagavan said, if you regard it as a dream, why should you be afraid of the dream? What is there to fear in a dream? You have to go and do your duty. But remember, he said, I am with you wherever you are. That was his final blessing, his final benediction to Papaji, that he ordered him to go back and rescue his family, which he did, and said, I am with you wherever you are. Papaji prostrated to him on the hill. He took a pinch of soil from under Bhagavan's feet and kept it as the dust from the Guru's feet, went off, rescued his family, and never got the opportunity to come back again, because after partition he spent the next 3 years looking after his family in Lucknow. There is one other story of a devotee who, how we say, it was allowed to come, or his desire was so strong to see Bhagavan that nothing could stop him from meeting him on the hill. This is a version of a Robert Adams story that doesn't appear to be in any of the accounts of his meetings with Bhagavan that have appeared in all the various audio tapes and online transcripts. It was told to me by a close devotee of his who ended up writing a short biographical screenplay of how Robert Adams came to Tiruvannamalai and how he met Bhagavan. Now, Robert Adams was a teenage boy. I think he was only 18 years old when he first came to Bhagavan. He'd been sent here by Yogananda, Paramahamsa Yogananda in California, who said that he should go to Tiruvannamalai and that Bhagavan was his guru. He arrived. I should mention that Robert Adams was already in an extremely advanced state. In his younger life, he discovered that he had this siddhi, this supernatural power, that whatever he said out loud manifested. So he said, this is the perfect supernatural power for a kid to have. You could stand outside the candy store and say, "Candy, candy," and the candy would appear in his hand. And he said whenever he had tests at school, he never had to do any homework. He would just sit down and say, "Answer, answer," and his pen would scribble the right answer. So he went through life having it very easy. And then at some point in his early teens, I think he was doing another test, and instead of saying "answer, answer," he made the mistake, or possibly not a mistake, of saying "God, God, God." And instead of getting the answer to his test, he actually got the experience of God. He said that this had never occurred to me before, but as soon as I said "God, God, God," I actually entered the state of godliness. I had the God experience, and it stayed with me. He said that was the beginning, the middle and end of my sadhana. I just randomly said "God, God, God" when I was a teenager. I had the experience. But my feeling is there was something that wasn't totally complete. I think if you are still hungering for a guru, if you need to go to look for someone outside of yourself, then there's something that's not complete, something is not final. So he went to first a Christian mystic called Joel Goldsmith, then he went to Paramahamsa Yogananda, and finally he came to Bhagavan here around 1947. He arrived with no He said, I didn't have a plan. I didn't think of this in advance, but I arrived in Tiruvannamalai. I was told Bhagavan was walking on the hill, and he said, suddenly I don't know what came over me. I rushed up the hill, I found where Bhagavan was, and with no prior decision, no thought about it, I took all my clothes off. I had this peculiar idea, just on the spur of the moment, that I should present myself stark naked to my guru and prostrate at his feet with no clothes on. He said it was a completely mad idea. I don't know why I did it. He said I just felt compelled that as I threw myself at the feet of my guru, I had to be absolutely physically naked as well as mentally naked. I think Bhagavan could see what an advanced state he was in, so he didn't mind this crazy teenager stripping off and prostrating in front of him. He helped him to his feet, he got him dressed, he took him to the ashram. And then, interestingly, this was a time in Bhagavan's life when lots and lots of people were in the ashram, and on the whole, new people weren't getting a lot of personalized attention. He said that Bhagavan gave him a room in the ashram, made sure he had a place to stay, and even better than that, he brought food to his room and personally served him to make sure he was being properly looked after in the ashram. I think that's an indication that Bhagavan knew this man was in a very high state, and that his thirst for a guru, his God intoxication, had caused him to run up the hill, break the ashram rules, break all kinds of rules by stripping off and throwing himself at Bhagavan's feet. But when these things happened, Bhagavan could see that there was a spiritual maturity that was the motivating factor. He didn't mind. Now there's one story, it's a long and complicated, but it's my all-time favourite story about Bhagavan on the hill, because it illustrates so many good points about how Bhagavan rooted for the underdog in one sense, how he cared for the apparently insignificant devotees, and how if you really depended on Bhagavan and trusted him, he will be there for you. Now in 1945, Bhagavan either broke a toe or severely sprained it. It swelled up to a huge size and he couldn't walk on it properly. He was ordered by his doctor to limit his movement. He was allowed to go to the bathroom, to the dining room and back to the old hall, and that was that. Now T.P. Ramachandra Iyer, who was the ashram lawyer, and a friend of his wanted to go to Skandashram after a lunch, and this was about 3 weeks after Bhagavan had damaged his toe. So in those days it was traditional to tell Bhagavan if you were going off on a trip and to ask his permission. So they went up to Bhagavan after lunch and said, Bhagavan, we'd like to go to Skandashram, may we have your permission? And Bhagavan looked rather wistfully at them and said, oh, what a good idea, will you take me with you? And TPR, he was absolutely horrified, as was Rangaswamy, the attendant, who was under orders from the doctor to minimize movement from Bhagavan. So everyone said, no, you can't possibly do that, you've been told to rest, there's no way that your damaged toe would get you up to Skandashram and back. So Bhagavan looked at his attendant and said rather mournfully, they don't want to take us, they're not going to allow us to come with them. So Ramachandra started to walk up the hill, and then after some time they stopped and they saw Bhagavan and Rangaswamy starting to climb the hill. So because this was towards the end of the month that Bhagavan had been prohibited from walking on the hill, they thought nothing of it. They just thought, oh, Bhagavan's trying out his toe to see if he can manage walking on the hill again. Then Bhagavan disappeared from view. Rangaswamy came up and said, it's all right, we're not following you, we're just going for a little walk. When I take Bhagavan back to the hall, I'll come with you to Skandashram. Please wait for me, I won't be long. So they sat on a rock, waited and waited and waited. Nothing happened. Rangaswamy didn't reappear. And then a watchman who was looking after Skandashram appeared. He had been asked to take some food to a sadhu who was then living in Skandashram. So Ramachandra asked, well, have you seen Rangaswami? He's supposed to be joining us. Is anybody else on the path? And the food courier looked a bit uneasy and said no. And they thought, he's covering up here. So they asked again, and they said, well, actually Bhagavan is slowly coming up with Rangaswami, his attendant. So Ramachandra thought, well, this is terrible. Rushed down the hill, and they found Bhagavan in an extremely fragile state. This was a hot time of the year. It was after lunch. He was so enfeebled by his month of inactivity that he wasn't able to walk by himself anymore. He was actually crawling on his hands and knees. He had cuts on his palms, he had cuts on his toes, and apparently sweat was pouring off his body. And Rangaswami, the attendant, was pleading with him, saying, Bhagavan, you can't deal with this. You haven't walked on the hill for a month. Your body's not up to this. We have to go back. And Bhagavan absolutely refused. He said, no, I'm going to Skandashram. I have to go to Skandashram. So in the face of this refusal to go back down the hill, Rangaswami and Ramachandra, they lifted him up by the armpits on either side, and they more or less dragged him to Skandashram, where he collapsed on the ground. There was a worker there who had been doing some work for the ashram, and Bhagavan asked him if he had anything to eat, and the worker was a little bit embarrassed because he'd already eaten his lunch. And Bhagavan said, never mind, maybe there's something left in your bowl you can give me, just mix it with a little water and I'll take that. So the man had eaten some kind of sticky porridge, and the residue was adhering to the side of the bowl. So this was taken to the Skandashram spring. It was mixed up with a little water, and Bhagavan drank this very, very diluted porridge mix and started to recover. Then Bhagavan turned to this man whose porridge leftovers he'd eaten and said, I came here because of you. I came because you prayed to me. And the man was absolutely delighted, and of course everybody else was wondering what's going on. Why has Bhagavan almost killed himself to come up here on a hot day when he was under doctor's orders to stay in the ashram? And then Bhagavan, of course, realized that the other people didn't have access to the knowledge that he did. He said, we were in the new hall. 4 pillars had just been finished, and there was a puja going on to consecrate these 4 new pillars. This man from Skandashram was standing in the crowd there, watching me go with the priests as they went round these pillars one by one and bless them. And this man had the thought, these are important people, they have their work blessed by Bhagavan. I'm repainting Skandashram, I'm whitewashing Skandashram. Bhagavan never comes to Skandashram. How can I ever get him to appreciate what I've done, because he never comes up here anymore? So somehow, telepathically, Bhagavan tuned into this, and despite his absolute physical inability to make the trip, he went there on his bleeding hands and knees. He almost collapsed, simply because one man had made an unconscious mental plea or complaint to himself and to Bhagavan that he was working very hard, he was also doing stuff for the ashram, and that no one was appreciating him or his work. Bhagavan tuned into that and absolutely defied all instructions to the contrary, and almost killed himself getting up to Skandashram so that he could give darshan to this man and give him the satisfaction of having his own work inspected and approved by Bhagavan.